The sun hung low over Venice, gilding the canals in hues of molten gold as Emma and James stepped off the vaporetto. The newlyweds breathed in the city's intoxicating blend of sea breeze and history, their hands tightly clasped. This was their honeymoon, the beginning of their adventure together, and Venice was their dream destination.
Emma turned to James, her eyes bright. "It's like walking through a painting," she murmured, gazing at the ochre facades and shadowed alleyways.
James squeezed her hand. "A masterpiece," he agreed, "and it's ours to explore."
The narrow streets pulsed with life, tourists bustling towards St. Mark's Basilica, the hum of conversations in a dozen languages, the occasional deep-throated call of a gondolier seeking passengers. It was a city both eternal and ephemeral, where past and present interwove like the delicate lace sold in shop windows. A gondolier, older than the rest, approached them with a knowing smile.
"A perfect evening for a ride, no? The canals, they whisper their secrets only to those who listen."
James exchanged a glance with Emma.
"Sounds perfect."
The gondolier led them to his sleek black gondola.
"My name is Lorenzo," he said, tipping his hat. "Venice has many faces, but only those willing to see past the mask will glimpse its true heart."
Emma shivered slightly at his words, though the air remained warm. She and James settled into the gondola as it glided from the dock, the world narrowing to the hush of lapping water and the creak of wood beneath them. Venice unfolded around them like a living tapestry. Moonlight danced on the rippling surface, and the water mirrored the grandeur of ancient palazzos. They drifted past silent alleyways, darkened doorways, and over bridges where lovers stood entwined in shadows.
"Venice," Lorenzo mused, his voice low, "is a city built on both dreams and sacrifices. Many who come never truly leave."
Emma leaned against James, letting the city's spell take hold. She barely noticed as they drifted under a bridge, shadows cascading over them. But then the world tilted. The air chilled. The sounds of Venice hushed as though someone had pressed a finger to its lips. She sat upright, pulse quickening.
"James, something feels—"
The words died on her lips. Lorenzo was gone.
James frowned, scanning the boat. Where did he?
He trailed off, his voice swallowed by an unnatural silence. The gondola rocked, still moving forward, though neither of them touched the oar. Emma turned her head, and a cold dread coiled in her stomach. The Grand Canal, always lively, was empty. No boats, no voices, no tourists snapping pictures. The city was there, yet utterly abandoned, a beautiful corpse devoid of breath. Emma's breath quickened.
"James, where is everyone?"
James shook his head, gripping the gondola's edge as though to steady himself.
We just passed people minutes ago."
The gondola nudged against a dock, as if beckoning them to step ashore.
"I don't like this."
Emma whispered, but James reached for her hand, offering a reassuring squeeze.
"We need to find someone," he said. "Come on."
They stepped onto the dock, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty silence. The city loomed around them, as grand and haunting as ever, but utterly still. Emma and James exchanged a look. Venice had changed, and whatever had happened beneath that bridge, they were no longer in the same city they had entered. The streets were eerily still as Emma and James moved through them, their urgency tempered by an overwhelming sense of unease. As they walked, they noticed unsettling details. Plates of food abandoned at outdoor cafes, a glass of wine tipped over, its contents darkening the white linen of a tablecloth. A cigarette still smoldered in an ashtray. The city wasn't just empty. It was as if everyone had vanished in an instant, in the middle of whatever they were doing.
"James,"
Emma whispered, her voice barely above the silence pressing in on them.
"this doesn't make sense. It's like they were here just moments ago."
James nodded grimly.
"There's no sign of struggle, no chaos, just absence."
They passed a souvenir shop, its door standing ajar, postcards fluttering in the faint breeze. Emma peered inside. The cash register was open, a transaction frozen mid-process, euros scattered across the counter. Someone had been here, but where had they gone? They turned onto a wider boulevard leading toward the Piazza San Marco. The basilica rose before them, its golden mosaics gleaming under the fading sunlight. The square, usually overflowing with tourists and pigeons, was vast and empty. The only movement came from the lapping waters of the canal beyond. James released a slow breath.
"This is impossible. There should be hundreds of people here."
Emma swallowed.
"And yet—"
Then she saw it, a single object out of place in the pristine emptiness. A policeman's hat lay discarded on the cobblestones, its emblem glinting faintly in the dimming light. James picked it up, turning it over in his hands.
Maybe he ran,
Emma suggested.
or someone took him.
James glanced around.
If he ran, where are his footprints? And why would he leave his hat?
They both turned in unison as a sudden sound shattered the silence. A faint, distant scraping. Something, or someone, was nearby. James took Emma's hand, squeezing it tightly.
We're not alone.
They scanned the vast, empty square, their breath caught in their throats. And then they saw it. A figure standing motionless at the far end of the piazza, half hidden in the shadows. Watching them. James took a step forward, his voice steady despite the tension gripping his chest.
Hello?
He called, his voice carrying across the silent square.
Who's there?
Emma clutched his arm, her breath shallow. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Then it moved. Slow, deliberate steps echoed against the stone as the figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a slightly disheveled suit, as though he had been caught in the middle of something important. His face was pale, eyes sunken, and his expression unreadable. James tightened his grip on Emma's hand.
Who are you?
James asked, his voice firm but wary.
Do you know what's going on?
The man tilted his head slightly, as if measuring them. Then he spoke in a voice rough with exhaustion.
You shouldn't be here.
Emma exhaled sharply.
What do you mean? Where is everyone?
The man's gaze flickered between them, before settling on something unseen beyond their shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper.
There isn't much time. If you want to leave, you have to listen very carefully.
James and Emma exchanged a glance, their unease deepening.
Leave?
James echoed.
We don't even know what's happening.
The man ran a hand through his dark hair, his fingers trembling slightly.
No one does at first.
His eyes locked onto Emma's, and she felt a cold dread settle over her.
You came on the water, didn't you?
Emma hesitated.
Yes, we took a gondola.
The man inhaled sharply. Emma's heart pounded.
What do you mean?
The man looked around the deserted square, scanning the shadows like he expected something or someone to emerge.
They'll notice you soon.
His voice dropped further.
You have to find the...
A distant sound cut him off, a sharp clang, like metal striking stone. The stranger stiffened, his expression darkening.
No more time?
He muttered. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, and pressed it into James' hand.
Read this only when you're alone, and whatever you do, don't stay out after dark.
James barely had time to react before the man turned and walked briskly toward one of the side streets, disappearing into the labyrinth of Venice's alleyways. Emma let out a shaky breath.
James, what the hell was that?
James opened the note. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic.
There is only one way out. Find the door that doesn't belong.
They stared at the cryptic message, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The wind picked up, whispering through the empty streets. The sun was sinking below the horizon. Night was coming. James folded the note, his fingers tightening around the fragile paper. The words pressed into his thoughts, but a more immediate concern loomed over them. The light was fading, shadows stretching long across the Piazza San Marco.
We need to find a place to stay.
James said.
I don't want to be out here when it gets dark.
They turned down one of the narrow alleys branching off the square, the buildings looming over them like silent sentinels. The city was still unnervingly empty, but there were signs of recent activity. Lights glowed in some windows, and the occasional door stood ajar. Yet, not a single voice reached them. Emma tried the handle of a hotel entrance, a small 3-story building with iron balconies. It didn't budge.
Locked,
she muttered. James stepped back, scanning their surroundings.
Let's try something bigger. Maybe one of the hotels near the Grand Canal.
They wound through the streets, their steps quickening as the last traces of daylight slipped away. At last, they reached a grander hotel, a towering structure with intricate carvings along its facade. The Hotel Palazzo Vento. The front doors were open. James hesitated.
Do we just go in?
At this point, I don't think we have a choice.
Inside, the lobby was lavish but abandoned. A polished marble floor stretched beneath a grand chandelier, its crystals twinkling in the dim glow of wall sconces. Suitcases were scattered near the check-in desk, as if their owners had left in a hurry. Emma ran her fingers along the desk, feeling the fine layer of dust.
This place hasn't been empty for long.
James turned the guest ledger toward him. The last entry was scrawled hastily, the ink smudged.
Left in a hurry, something isn't right. If you're reading this, get out before dark.
James pushed the book away, his pulse quickening.
Someone knew something.
Emma backed away from the desk.
Let's find a room. We'll lock the door, sleep in shifts if we have to.
They climbed the sweeping staircase, passing rooms with doors slightly ajar, revealing untouched beds and open suitcases. The eerie normalcy of it all sent shivers down Emma's spine. Finally, they reached a corner suite. James pushed the door open. It was pristine. The bed freshly made, the window open just slightly, allowing in a cool breeze. Emma shut the door behind them and locked it. James pulled a chair against it for good measure. For the first time since stepping off the gondola, Emma let out a deep sigh.
I don't know what's happening, but we'll figure it out in the morning.
James sat beside her on the bed, the note from the stranger still clenched in his fingers.
Yeah.
He murmured, but his eyes were drawn to the words again.
Find the door that doesn't belong.
As exhaustion finally pulled at them, Venice remained silent outside. Yet as James drifted to sleep, he thought he heard something. Footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate. And then, just beyond their door, a quiet knock. The knock was soft, almost polite. James and Emma sat frozen on the bed, their breath held. The sound had been unmistakable, 3 distinct taps against the wood. James swallowed, forcing himself to move. He stood, his fingers brushing against the note still clutched in his palm. Emma's voice was barely a whisper.
Don't.
He hesitated, but curiosity, or maybe defiance, pushed him forward. He reached for the handle, turned the lock, and pulled the door open. Nothing. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, bathed in dim golden light from the wall sconces. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and unnatural. Emma rose slowly, her gaze flicking past James into the corridor.
Someone knocked.
He stepped outside, peering down the hall. The only sign of movement was a long curtain at the far end, rustling slightly as if a draft had caught it. But there was no open window, no breeze. James took a cautious step forward.
Hello?
His voice echoed down the empty corridor. No response. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, unease coiling tightly in her stomach.
James, come back inside.
He lingered for a moment, staring at the vacant hallway. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older, something he couldn't quite place. He looked down, scanning the floor for footprints, scuff marks, anything to indicate that someone had stood there just moments ago. There was nothing. He exhaled, retreating into the room.
No one's there.
Emma shut the door quickly, locking it again.
But someone knocked.
James nodded, his mind racing.
Or something did.
They sat in silence, listening, waiting. The city outside remained still, as if Venice itself were holding its breath. Then the sound returned. But this time, it wasn't a knock. It was a whisper. Just outside their door, faint and indecipherable, a voice, soft and breathy, like wind through old pages, spoke words neither of them could understand. Emma's fingers dug into James's arm. He pulled her closer, his own breath shallow. The whispering continued for a moment longer, then stopped. Silence. James slowly reached for the note again, rereading the words in his head.
Find the door that doesn't belong.
He exhaled shakily.
Emma, I think we need to leave now.
She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. They both stood, hesitant, listening once more for any sound beyond the door. Nothing. James took a deep breath, grabbed Emma's hand, and reached for the door handle again. This time, they were the ones stepping into the unknown. James didn't wait. He unlocked the door and pulled it open, peering into the hallway once more. It looked exactly as it had moments ago, empty, silent, untouched. The eerie whispering had stopped, and the strange presence, whatever it had been, was gone.
Let's go.
Emma exhaled shakily, gripping a hand to her chest. They stepped out cautiously, moving quickly down the hall toward the grand staircase. Their footsteps echoed off the marble floors as they descended, each step carrying them farther from the unsettling events of the night. The lobby was just as they had left it, abandoned, eerily preserved. The suitcases still sat near the check-in desk, the chandelier cast warm, flickering light over the room. If not for the impossible emptiness of the city, it would have looked perfectly normal. The moment they stepped outside, the heaviness in the air seemed to lift. The eerie stillness of the hotel melted away, leaving only the cool night breeze and the gentle lapping of water against the canal walls.
It's like
Like whatever was in there didn't follow us.
she finished. They both stood there for a moment, listening. The city remained quiet, but without the suffocating sense of being watched. It wasn't normal, but it wasn't terrifying either. James unfolded the note again.
Find the door that doesn't belong.
Emma frowned.
If we're going to figure this out, we need to think logically. What could that mean?
James nodded, scanning their surroundings.
A door that doesn't belong? Maybe something out of place architecturally, or something hidden in plain sight.
They turned toward the narrow streets, away from the canal. The buildings around them loomed with their centuries-old facades, their wooden doors worn from time. But nothing looked unusual. Emma suddenly stopped.
James, wait.
She turned slowly, her gaze lifting toward a building on the corner of the street. It was elegant but nondescript, a Venetian palazzo like so many others. But as she studied it, her stomach tightened. Something was wrong. James followed her gaze.
What is it?
Emma took a step closer, her eyes scanning the details. The windows were shuttered, but one of them looked different. It was slightly recessed compared to the others, like it had been added later, or like it had once been something else.
A door?
She murmured.
That used to be a door.
James frowned.
You think?
I think we just found the first real clue.
For the first time since this nightmare began, the city wasn't just swallowing them whole. It was revealing something. And they were going to find out what it meant. Emma and James stood in front of the building, the former door now disguised as a window. A cool breeze rustled through the empty street, but the weight of their discovery filled the silence between them.
We can't just break in,
Emma said, glancing around.
We need to know what we're dealing with first.
James nodded, stepping back to take in the full structure.
If this was once a door, then someone sealed it off. Maybe the building has some history we can find.
Emma turned in a slow circle, scanning the deserted streets. Then she spotted something.
The bookstore,
she whispered. A few buildings down, a small sign hung above a narrow shopfront. Libreria Salvatori. Through its dusty window, shelves of old books leaned precariously, filled with volumes long untouched.
If anywhere still has records, it's a place like that.
They moved quickly to the shop, the door creaking as James pushed it open. A faint scent of parchment and leather filled the air, mingled with the stale stillness of a place long abandoned. Emma hesitated.
What if we find something we don't want to know?
James glanced at her, his fingers resting lightly against the spines of the books.
I'd rather know than stay in the dark.
They split up, scanning the shelves. Most books were literature, travelogues, and forgotten poetry collections, but Emma soon found a section labeled Venetian Architecture and History. She pulled down a heavy tome with yellowed pages, flipping through old maps and sketches of buildings. Then, something caught her eye.
A Palazzo di Ricordi, the Palace of Memories.
James leaned over her shoulder.
That's the building,
he whispered. The sketch was eerily familiar. But what stood out most was the small handwritten note beside it.
The door remains closed, it must remain closed.
Emma traced her fingers over the words.
Who wrote this?
James reached for another book, a dusty ledger from a local historian. He flipped through it quickly until he landed on a page marked with an old newspaper clipping.
1872 disappearance at the Palazzo di Ricordi.
His breath caught.
Emma, listen to this.
She leaned in as he read aloud.
The Palazzo di Ricordi, long abandoned, has become a subject of fear among the city's inhabitants. Once a vibrant home to scholars and artists, it was sealed decades ago after a series of unexplained disappearances. Residents report hearing voices behind its walls, and many claim to have seen a door appear and disappear overnight. It is said that those who enter, searching for answers, never return.
Emma swallowed hard.
That can't be real.
James flipped to another page, one handwritten in ink that had slightly bled into the parchment. It was a list of names. The last few entries were smudged, but one stood out clearly. Emma gasped.
The gondolier?
James stared at the name, his mind racing.
Whatever happened at that building, Lorenzo was part of it.
The weight of the discovery settled between them. The building, the missing people, the door that should remain closed, it was all connected. And now, they had to decide whether to listen to the warnings. Open the door. Emma and James stood in the dusty bookstore, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. The name Lorenzo lingered in the air like an unspoken question, but neither of them wanted to delay any longer.
We have to go.
Emma nodded.
Before we lose our nerve.
The city remained silent as they stepped out of the bookstore and walked toward the Palazzo di Ricordi. The building loomed ahead, its elegant facade hiding the history buried within. The night sky cast shifting shadows over its walls, the window that had once been a door standing eerily out of place. James ran his fingers along the stone.
There has to be a way in.
Emma scanned the structure, then pointed toward a narrow alley. There might be another entrance. They moved cautiously down the alley, the air growing colder as the walls closed in around them. Then, at the end of the passage, they saw it. A door. It hadn't been there before.
James?
The wood was old, yet pristine, as if untouched by time. No dust, no weathering. The brass handle gleamed even in the dim light.
This is the door that doesn't belong.
A shiver ran down Emma's spine.
But if it's here, it means someone else has opened it before.
They exchanged a glance. Then, before either of them could second-guess, James turned the handle and pushed. The door swung open. The air inside was different, thick, stagnant, charged with something unseen. The space beyond was not just a room, it was something else entirely. James stepped inside first, Emma close behind. Their footsteps barely made a sound on the polished floor. The interior was vast, lined with walls of faded frescoes and towering bookshelves. Dust swirled in the weak glow of a single flickering chandelier. But there was something wrong. The furniture was arranged as if someone had just left. A chair pulled out, a glass of water still half full on a nearby table. Papers were scattered across a desk, a pen resting atop them. Emma ran her fingers along one of the chairs.
It was warm.
James,
She whispered, this place isn't abandoned.
A soft creak echoed through the room. They both turned sharply. A single doorway stood across from them, leading into darkness. A faint movement, a shadow too tall and too thin, shifted just beyond its frame. Then the whispering began again. Not from the doorway, from inside the room, right behind them. The whispering was close, too close. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. James was beside her, his stance rigid, his fingers curling into fists. They weren't alone. The room was vast, but in the dim light, movement flickered at the edges of their vision. A presence, something just beyond the reach of clarity, shifted through the air like a ripple in still water. James took a step forward.
Who's there?
Silence. Emma's throat was dry.
We know about the disappearances. We know about the door.
Still, nothing. Then, from the darkness of the far doorway, came a sound, a slow, deliberate scrape against the floor. A figure emerged. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its shape humanoid, but wrong. The way it moved, the way it seemed to flicker in and out of focus, made Emma's stomach twist with instinctual dread. James inhaled sharply but held his ground.
What do you want?
The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned its head, too slowly, too precisely. And then, in a motion so fluid it felt surreal, it lifted something in its hand. An object. Small. Round. Metallic. James stepped forward, hesitating only for a fraction of a second before he reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the object, the whispering stopped. The room fell into a suffocating silence. James pulled the item closer, his pulse hammering. It was old, an antique pocket watch, its silver casing tarnished with age. But despite its wear, the glass was pristine, and the hands were moving. Emma frowned.
It's working?
James flipped it over, his breath catching at the inscription on the back. The name was etched into the metal in delicate, curling script. Emma exhaled, her mind racing.
This belonged to him.
The moment she spoke, the figure in the shadows moved. Not a step, not a turn, it simply shifted. One moment it was in the doorway, the next it was right beside them. Emma gasped, stumbling back, but James held onto the watch, gripping it like an anchor. The figure loomed over them, impossibly tall, featureless, its presence pressing against them like the weight of the entire room was tilting toward it. Then, in a voice not spoken, but somehow felt, it whispered.
Return what was taken.
The chandelier flickered. The walls seemed to stretch. The air felt thinner. Emma clutched James's arm.
We need to go.
James didn't hesitate. He shoved the watch into his pocket and grabbed Emma's hand. Together they bolted toward the door. Behind them, the whispering began again. Faster, louder, as if whatever was in that room was now awake. James and Emma didn't stop running until they were back in the open streets, the oppressive silence of the Palazzo di Ricordi left behind. James exhaled sharply, glancing down at his pocket where the antique watch pressed against his palm. Its metal was unnaturally cold, despite the warmth of his skin. Emma paced beside him, still catching her breath.
We need to figure out what this thing is before we do anything else.
James nodded.
Agreed. The bookstore had records. Maybe there's something there about Lorenzo, who he really was, why this watch is connected to him.
They hurried back toward Libreria Salvatore, slipping inside the dusty bookshop once more. The warm scent of parchment and old wood did little to ease their nerves. James placed the watch on the counter. The second hand continued its steady ticking, but something about it felt off. Too precise, too deliberate. Emma flipped open the historian's ledger again, running her fingers down the list of names until she found it.
Lorenzo Santori, last seen October 1872.
James frowned.
1872? That's the same date as the newspaper clipping about the palazzo.
Emma turned the page and gasped.
James, look.
Below Lorenzo's name was a brief, almost hurried note.
Believed to have taken something he shouldn't have. Was last seen near the Grand Canal before vanishing. The watch is the key.
James and Emma exchanged a look.
The watch is the key?
Emma repeated.
Key to what?
James turned back to the timepiece, hesitating before picking it up again. The moment his fingers touched the metal, the room shifted. The dust-filled air seemed to bend, as if space itself was rippling.
James, something's happening.
Bookshelves swayed, not physically, but like they were warping, their edges stretching and distorting as though they were being viewed through rippling water. Emma stumbled back. James gritted his teeth, holding onto the watch tightly. His pulse pounded as his vision flickered. One moment he was in the bookstore, the next he was somewhere else entirely. He saw Venice, but not as it was now. The city was bustling, alive with people dressed in elegant 19th century clothing. Gondolas moved along the Grand Canal, music drifted through the air. The streets were full. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision fractured. Darkness swallowed it, leaving behind only a whisper.
Return what was taken.
James gasped as he was yanked back into reality. The bookstore snapped into focus, Emma's face inches from his, her hands gripping his shoulders.
James, are you okay?
James blinked rapidly. The watch still ticked in his palm, but now he knew. It wasn't just showing time. It was connected to it. Emma's voice was tight with fear.
What did you see?
James clenched the watch, his breathing uneven.
I saw Venice the way it used to be.
He swallowed.
And something else, a warning.
Emma straightened.
Then, we need to find out where Lorenzo took this watch before he disappeared.
James nodded, his grip tightening on the timepiece. But as they turned to leave the bookstore, they heard it. Tick. Not just from the watch. The entire shop. Books creaked on their shelves. The floorboards gave a slow, rhythmic groan. The walls themselves were ticking. The world around them was beginning to move.
The ticking grew louder. It wasn't just coming from the watch, it was everywhere.
The bookshelves groaned as if their wooden frames were shifting. The glass windows trembled in their frames. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange, rhythmic pulse.
We need to get out of here, now.
Emma grabbed James's arm. James didn't argue. Clutching the watch, he rushed toward the door with Emma close behind. The moment they stepped outside, the oppressive ticking stopped. The city fell silent once more. Emma exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest.
That was
not normal.
James finished.
They stood in the quiet, their breaths coming fast. The street was just as empty as before. The bookstore behind them now looked completely still, as if nothing had happened inside at all. James turned the watch over in his hands, the inscription Lorenzo gleaming under the dim streetlights. He remembered the vision, the Venice of the past, full of life. A city before the disappearances, before the silence.
We need to go to Piazza San Marco,
he said. Emma hesitated.
Why there?
James frowned.
I don't know, but I have a feeling that's where this is leading us.
Emma nodded, trusting his instinct.
Then let's move.
The piazza. The walk to Piazza San Marco felt surreal. The streets remained empty, yet the city didn't feel abandoned anymore. There was a weight in the air, a presence. By the time they reached the square, the moon had risen high above the city. The basilica loomed before them, its golden mosaics catching the dim light. The massive open plaza stretched around them, eerily vacant. But something was wrong. Emma stopped in her tracks.
James, look.
The clock tower. It was moving. James followed her gaze to the Grand Torre dell'Orologio, the famous clock of Venice. The mechanism should have been stopped like everything else in this frozen version of the city. But the hands were moving, ticking. Slowly, deliberately. The watch in James's palm pulsed in time with it.
It's connected, the watch and the clock.
Emma took a shaky step forward. James swallowed hard.
Lorenzo must have been here. Maybe he was trying to fix something.
They moved cautiously toward the tower, its massive face glowing eerily in the moonlight. As they got closer, James noticed something beneath it. A small arched doorway, tucked into the base of the structure. Emma frowned.
That wasn't always there, was it?
James ran a hand over the old stone. The door was worn, its edges barely visible, like it had been sealed away for years, maybe centuries. Then, as they stood before it, the watch in James's hand clicked open on its own. A compartment inside revealed something neither of them had expected. A key. Emma inhaled sharply. James, this is it. James turned toward the hidden doorway, heart pounding.
Then let's find out what's behind it.
With the key in hand, he reached for the lock, and the city exhaled. The wind stirred around them. The clock hands sped up. The night air rippled, as if time itself was shifting. Emma grabbed James's wrist.
James, something's changing.
But it was too late. He turned the key, and the door swung open. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a dark passage that stretched beneath the city. A damp, musty breeze drifted up from below, carrying the scent of wet stone and ancient air.
It leads underground.
Emma hesitated at the threshold. James held up the watch, its faint ticking echoing in the stillness.
Lorenzo came this way.
He stepped inside, and Emma followed, their footsteps muffled against the old stone steps as they descended into the unknown. The air grew colder, and the walls glistened with moisture. Their only source of light was a dim, flickering lantern mounted along the passage, evidence that someone else had been here recently. Emma ran her fingers over the aged brass frame of the lantern.
This isn't ancient, it's been placed here.
James nodded.
We're not alone.
They moved deeper, their shadows stretching along the walls as the corridor widened into a vast underground chamber. The space was filled with remnants of a time long past. Old crates, tattered Venetian banners, wooden furniture draped in cobwebs. But amidst the relics, something stood out. A modern backpack, half unzipped. Emma's breath caught.
James, someone else has been here. Recently.
James knelt, cautiously unzipping the pack. Inside he found a notebook, a flashlight, and a bottle of water, its expiration date still fresh.
Whoever had left this hadn't been gone for long.
He flipped open the notebook, scanning the first few pages. The handwriting was hurried, frantic.
I followed the signs. The watch led me here. But something is wrong. The city isn't just empty. It's waiting. If I don't make it back, whoever finds this, don't trust the time.
Who wrote this?
Emma hovered over his shoulder.
And where are they now?
Before James could answer, a faint sound echoed through the tunnel. Footsteps, not theirs. They both turned toward the darkness at the far end of the chamber. Someone or something was coming. Emma and James locked eyes. No words were needed.
Hide?
James grabbed the backpack and slid behind a stack of old wooden crates, pulling Emma down beside him. They pressed against the damp stone, hearts pounding in sync with the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of approaching footsteps. The air was thick with tension. Whoever was coming, they weren't alone down here. The steps grew louder, deliberate, careful. A shadow flickered at the edge of their vision as someone emerged from the dark passage. A man, haggard, disheveled, his clothes damp and wrinkled, as if he had been down here far too long. His face was partially obscured by the dim light, but his cautious posture spoke of someone afraid. James barely breathed. Emma gripped his wrist as the man hesitated near the table where his notebook had been left open. His eyes darted across the space, scanning, searching. Then he reached for the notebook, flipping through the pages in frustration.
Where did you go?
The man muttered under his breath. His voice was hoarse, tired.
I swear I just heard you.
Emma's grip on James tightened. He wasn't talking to them. James remained frozen as the man's gaze swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. For a moment, it seemed he would leave. Then he stopped. Something had caught his attention. Slowly, he turned his head toward the darkest corner of the room, the space where the lantern's glow did not reach. His breathing hitched. James and Emma heard it too. A whisper, faint, not from them. The man's face paled, his fingers tightening around the notebook as he stumbled back.
No.
He whispered, shaking his head.
No, not again.
Then, In one fluid motion, he bolted. Emma barely stifled a gasp as the man sprinted back down the passage from where he came. His footsteps echoed in frantic retreat, vanishing into the dark. James exhaled shakily.
What the hell was that?
Emma's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths.
He wasn't running from us.
Silence hung heavy around them. The tunnel breathed, the air feeling suddenly thicker. James gritted his teeth.
Whatever scared him is still here.
And then, from the shadows, the whispering began again. James didn't hesitate. We have to go after him. Emma pushed herself to her feet, nodding quickly.
If he knows what's happening, we need answers.
They darted from behind the crates, their footsteps quick but cautious as they followed the fading echoes of the man's retreat. The underground passage twisted ahead of them, damp walls pressing close, the scent of ancient stone thick in the air. Ahead, the man's shadow flickered at the edge of the lantern light. He was moving fast, but not fast enough to disappear completely.
Wait!
James called. We just want to talk. The man skidded to a stop at a fork in the tunnel, his breath ragged. He spun toward them, his eyes wild, fear carved into the deep lines of his face.
You shouldn't be here.
Emma stepped forward, holding up his notebook.
You left this behind.
The man's gaze flicked to it, then back to them. His jaw clenched.
I thought I was alone.
James pressed forward.
Who are you?
The man hesitated, swallowing hard. Then, almost reluctantly, he muttered.
Marco.
Emma exhaled sharply.
Marco, what is this place? Why did you leave in such a hurry?
Marco wiped a shaky hand over his face.
Because I've seen what happens when you stay too long.
Before they could ask more, a strange glow flickered against the damp stone walls. All three turned. The tunnel around them changed, not physically, but something had awakened. Words had appeared along the tunnel's surface, carved into the old stone, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to notice. The glow pulsed softly, illuminating ancient Venetian script, intertwined with more modern etchings, a patchwork of warnings scrawled across the passage. Emma stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she read aloud.
The city remembers.
James traced his fingers over another section.
Time does not forget.
Marco stood frozen.
This wasn't here before.
Emma turned to him.
What does it mean?
Marco shook his head, voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know. But it's not the first time I've seen something like this.
James frowned.
Where else?
Marco hesitated. Then grimly he muttered.
Above ground near the clock tower.
Emma's stomach twisted.
Piazza San Marco.
The pieces were falling into place. The watch, the time anomalies, the writing that seemed to appear when no one was looking. Something wanted to be remembered. James tightened his grip on the watch.
We need to go back.
Marco paid.
You don't understand. The more you follow this, the more it follows you.
Emma locked eyes with him.
Then tell us what happens if we don't stop.
Marco's face was grim as he exhaled slowly.
Then you disappear like the rest.
Emma and James stood firm, blocking Marco's escape route. The eerie glow of the writing on the walls had faded, leaving only its ominous warning behind. Marco shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward the tunnel behind them, as if he expected something, or someone, to emerge.
We're not going anywhere until you tell us everything.
James said, voice steady. Marco exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, like a man who had spent too long running from something he could never quite escape.
You don't understand?
He muttered.
The longer we stay down here, the more it notices us.
Emma crossed her arms.
Then start talking. What is it?
Marco hesitated, then took a deep breath.
This city is broken.
He said, or maybe it's not broken at all. Maybe it's caught.
Caught?
James frowned. Marco nodded.
Between moments, between time. Some people vanish all at once, others, they get lost in it, like Lorenzo.
Emma stiffened.
Lorenzo.
Marco motioned toward the watch in James's hand.
That belonged to him. But he wasn't just a gondolier. He was searching for something, just like we are.
Emma's pulse quickened.
And he disappeared.
Marco's jaw tightened.
Like so many others.
James held up the watch.
This thing is connected to it, isn't it? The writing, the missing people, the clock tower, it's all part of something bigger.
Marco exhaled.
I don't know exactly what the watch does, but I know this. It doesn't just keep time. It holds it.
Emma's stomach twisted.
What do you mean?
Marco looked at the walls around them, then back at James.
You saw it, didn't you?
James blinked.
Saw what?
Marco's voice dropped lower.
The way it was.
Emma sucked in a breath.
The vision?
James nodded slowly. It was real. Marco took a step closer.
That's why Lorenzo disappeared. He got too close to the truth, and if we're not careful, so will we.
A long silence stretched between them. James exhaled.
Then we need to find out what Lorenzo was looking for.
Marco shook his head.
I told you. The more you chase it, the more it chases you.
Emma's gaze hardened.
Then we stop running.
Marco studied them for a long moment, then sighed in defeat.
If you're going back to the clock tower, I won't stop you. But I won't follow you there either.
James nodded, gripping the watch tightly.
Then we'll find out what Lorenzo couldn't.
As they turned to leave, Marco's voice stopped them one last time.
If you open a door that wasn't meant to be opened,
He hesitated.
make sure you can close it.
James and Emma exchanged a glance. Then they stepped back into the darkness of the tunnels, heading toward whatever waited for them in Piazza San Marco. The tunnels stretched long and dark behind them, but James and Emma didn't look back. They moved quickly, the damp underground air giving way to the fresher scent of the open streets as they emerged back into Venice's eerie silence. The city remained unchanged, empty, breathless, as if waiting. James clenched the watch in his palm.
We go straight to the clock tower.
Emma nodded.
No more distractions.
They navigated the quiet alleyways, their footsteps echoing against the stone. The deeper they went into the heart of the city, the heavier the air felt. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible shift in pressure, but by the time they reached Piazza San Marco, Emma could feel it in her chest, the weight of something unseen. The Torre dell'Orologio loomed ahead, its intricate blue and gold clock face standing stark against the moonlit sky. The minute hand was still moving, and someone was waiting beneath it. James stopped abruptly, his breath catching. A figure stood just beyond the arched entrance at the base of the tower. They weren't moving. Emma stepped closer, her pulse pounding.
Who?
The figure took a step forward. The dim light revealed a man, tall, dressed in a dark, slightly tattered suit. His face was shadowed, but the unmistakable glint of silver flashed at his wrist. A watch. James's fingers tightened around the antique timepiece in his hand.
It's him.
Emma's breath hitched.
Lorenzo?
The man stepped fully into the light, and at last they saw his face. His eyes, sharp, dark, haunted, locked onto them with something between recognition and disbelief. His skin was pale, weathered by time but strangely ageless. He opened his mouth, his voice rough from disuse.
You shouldn't have come here.
Emma took a step forward.
You're Lorenzo.
The man didn't confirm or deny it. His gaze flicked to the watch in James's hand.
You found it?
He murmured. James held it up slightly.
It belonged to you.
Lorenzo exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling.
It still does.
Emma swallowed.
Then why did you leave it behind?
Lorenzo's jaw tensed.
Because I was trying to close the door.
James frowned.
What door?
Lorenzo's eyes darkened.
The one that should never have been opened.
A gust of wind rushed through the square, rattling the windows of the silent buildings. Lorenzo took a step toward them.
If you keep that watch, time will follow you. And once time finds you...
His voice was grim.
It doesn't let go.
Emma's stomach twisted.
What does that mean?
Lorenzo's gaze flicked past them, scanning the empty streets. Then, with sudden urgency, he stepped closer.
You don't have much time.
James stiffened.
Until what?
Lorenzo exhaled sharply, then said something that made Emma's blood run cold.
Until the city takes you too.
James and Emma didn't argue. They had seen enough to know that Lorenzo was telling the truth. The city was waiting. The city was watching. Emma swallowed hard.
Then tell us how to leave.
Lorenzo's jaw tensed.
You need to return the watch.
James glanced down at the silver timepiece in his palm.
Where?
Lorenzo's gaze was steady.
The place where it all started. You need to bring it back to the Grand Canal. To the water.
Emma's breath caught.
You mean the gondola?
Lorenzo nodded once.
That's where you crossed over. That's where you undo it.
James frowned.
And if we don't,
Lorenzo's gaze was grim.
then you won't leave at all.
Emma shivered. The weight of the watch in James's hand suddenly felt heavier. It wasn't just an object. It was a tether. James shoved the watch into his pocket.
Then we go.
They turned to leave, but Lorenzo froze. His expression changed, eyes narrowing as he stared at the far end of the piazza. Emma followed his gaze, and her stomach dropped. The shadows were moving. Not the way they should, stretching naturally with the dim glow of streetlights. No, they were shifting on their own, flickering, elongating, spilling across the cobblestone in ways that defied the light. Somewhere in the distance, a whisper carried on the wind. Emma grabbed James's wrist.
We need to go.
Lorenzo took a sharp step forward.
Don't look back, don't stop, just run.
James didn't hesitate. He took Emma's hand, and they sprinted across the piazza, the silent city stretching around them. Behind them, the shadows moved faster. They were no longer alone. Something was coming. Emma and James ran. The city stretched endlessly before them, its canals winding like veins through its silent streets. The Grand Canal lay ahead, a dark ribbon of water cutting through the heart of Venice. It was their only way out. Behind them, the shadows chased. James risked a glance back. His breath hitched. The darkness wasn't just stretching anymore. It was reaching. Long, distorted tendrils snaked across the cobblestones, spilling from alleyways, creeping toward them, as if the city itself refused to let them go. Lorenzo's voice rang in James's head.
Don't stop, don't look back, just run.
The edge of the canal came into view. A row of boats bobbed in the water, tied to the dock. Emma's breath was ragged.
We just need one.
James lunged forward, untying the nearest gondola. It wasn't the one they had arrived in, but it didn't matter. They just needed to leave. Emma scrambled in first, gripping the sides as James followed, shoving off from the dock with his foot. The gondola drifted into the water, just as the shadows reached the edge of the canal. They stopped. Emma's heart pounded as she turned back. The darkness pulsed, writhing against the stone, but it didn't cross the water. James gripped the oar.
It can't follow.
Lorenzo had been right. The answer had been the water all along. Emma exhaled sharply, gripping James's arm.
Then we finish this?
The Grand Canal stretched before them, leading back toward the bridge where this nightmare had begun. But even as they rode forward, a new fear crept into Emma's mind. The city wasn't stopping them anymore. It was letting them go, which meant whatever was waiting for them at the end was worse. The gondola cut through the Grand Canal, its oar slicing through the dark water. Emma and James didn't speak. They didn't dare. The city around them remained frozen in its eerie silence. No whispers, no shifting shadows, no unseen force trying to pull them back. Venice was letting them go, and that terrified Emma more than anything. James rowed with steady, urgent strokes, his eyes locked on their destination, the bridge where this all began. The place where they had drifted beneath an ordinary archway and stepped into a city that had forgotten time. Emma clutched the watch in her lap. It felt different now. No longer cold, no longer pulsing with something unnatural. It simply was, a relic of a time that had been stolen, a tether between past and present. As they neared the bridge, a figure stepped onto the dock. Emma's breath caught. Lorenzo. The gondolier stood waiting, his face unreadable in the moonlight. He didn't move as they approached, didn't wave them forward or warn them away. He only watched. James steered the gondola toward him, bringing them alongside the dock. Lorenzo finally spoke.
You understand now?
James exhaled.
I don't think we ever will.
Lorenzo's gaze drifted to the watch in Emma's hands.
Then you've already made your choice.
Emma swallowed, gripping the watch tighter.
It belongs here, doesn't it?
Lorenzo nodded.
It always did.
Emma hesitated. Then slowly, she lifted the watch over the side of the boat. The water below reflected the city's shimmering lights, a mirror of the world above. For a brief moment, she thought she saw another version of herself, staring back from the rippling surface, one who had never stepped into this version of Venice. A life untouched, a life where she and James had simply been two honeymooners in the real world. With a deep breath, Emma let go. The watch fell. The moment it touched the water, the city exhaled. A wave of warmth rushed through the air, like a breeze sweeping through a long dormant place. The clock tower in Piazza San Marco chimed, its bell ringing out into the night. Emma gripped the side of the gondola as the canal shifted, the rippling water distorting the reflection of the bridge above them. James grabbed her hand.
Hold on.
Lorenzo took a step back, his figure already fading into the haze.
Don't look back.
Emma squeezed her eyes shut as the world tilted. And then, silence. Sunlight streamed through the narrow Venetian alleyways, casting warm golden hues over the rippling canals. The air was thick with life, tourists bustling across Piazza San Marco, gondoliers calling out in rhythmic Italian, the distant sound of music spilling from a small cafe. Emma blinked against the bright sky, the sudden burst of sound and color disorienting. She was standing at the edge of a canal, James beside her. His hand was still wrapped around hers, his grip familiar and warm. A gondola drifted past, its gondolier singing softly, his oar cutting smoothly through the water. Emma exhaled, a strange pressure lifting from her chest. Hadn't something just happened?
Did we?
She trailed off, unsure of what she was even asking. James frowned slightly.
I feel like, I don't know.
He shook his head, a slow grin spreading across his face.
I think we're just exhausted.
Emma laughed, soft, uncertain.
Yeah, that must be it.
They started walking, the weight in the air gone, the city around them buzzing with normalcy. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet. As they passed a quiet dock, a gondola rocked gently against the water's edge, a sleek black vessel, unoccupied. Emma barely glanced at it, already turning to continue down the street. But for the briefest second, the water beneath it rippled. A flash of silver glinted just below the surface. Then nothing. Just the quiet lapping of waves against the ancient city. Venice whispered on, as it always had, as it always would. Time never forgets.